When I asked why I was not invited to my sister-in-law's wedding, my husband said my mother does not want you there. You are an embarrassment. Just 5 days earlier, I had paid for my mother-in-law's new $100 million mansion. I replied understood. But 1 hour later I did this. I am Kira, 33 years old, and the founder of a supply chain software empire that I built entirely from the ground up. I grew up with nothing, learning early on that survival meant working harder and smarter than everyone else in the room. Tonight I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in our Manhattan penthouse, carefully zipping up a custom haute couture gown I had specifically commissioned for the rehearsal dinner of my sister-in-law Serena. The wedding was supposed to be the social event of the season, marrying her off to Jamal, a brilliant neurosurgeon from a highly respected and powerful African-American family in Washington, D.C. I was adjusting the delicate silk fabric when the heavy oak door to my bedroom swung open. Preston, my husband of 3 years, strode in wearing his tailored tuxedo. He did not offer a compliment. He did not even look at me with an ounce of affection. Instead, he walked straight over to my vanity, picked up the thick gold embossed wedding invitation bearing my name and snatched it away. I turned around, confusion masking the sudden spike of adrenaline in my chest. I asked him what he was doing. Preston let out a cold, condescending laugh that echoed against the marble walls of our bedroom. "You are not coming," he stated flatly. "My mother does not want you there. In fact, none of us do. You are an embarrassment, Kira." He looked me up and down with absolute disgust, as if the expensive gown I wore was somehow offensive to his eyes. "Your new money, backwoods habits are going to humiliate us in front of Jamal's family. They are true elite intellectual royalty. We are a legacy family from the Hamptons. We cannot risk you opening your mouth and showing everyone how painfully uncultured you really are." The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air. Preston came from a family that constantly paraded their old money status, bragging about their ancestors who came over on the Mayflower. What he conveniently left out of his arrogant speech was the fact that his family had been entirely bankrupt for the last decade. They had lost everything due to terrible investments and a refusal to actually work for a living. I was the one funding his luxury cars, his tailored suits, and the lavish lifestyle his mother Beatrice paraded around in. I looked at my husband, this man I had once loved and trusted, and I saw nothing but a parasite dressed in a tuxedo. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not beg him to let me attend the wedding. Crying was for people who had no power. Instead, I smoothed the front of my dress, looked him dead in the eye, and kept my voice completely level. "Understood," I said softly. Preston looked momentarily surprised by my lack of resistance, but his arrogant smirk quickly returned. He adjusted his cufflinks, clearly satisfied that he had put me in my place. "Good," he replied. "Stay here. Do not call anyone. Do not cause a scene. I will tell them you had a sudden migraine." He turned on his heel and walked out of the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind him. The moment the latch clicked, the remaining warmth in my heart turned entirely to ice. I walked over to my safe, unlocked it, and pulled out my primary business phone. I dialed the direct line to my lead asset manager. The phone rang exactly once before he answered. "Execute the contingency protocol," I commanded, my voice devoid of any emotion. "I want every single black card attached to Preston's name canceled immediately. Freeze his secondary checking accounts and lock him out of the corporate expense portal. Do it right this second." My asset manager did not hesitate. "Done," he replied. "What about the Hamptons property?" I paused, thinking about Beatrice, my mother-in-law, who was currently treating that massive estate like her own personal kingdom. Just 5 days ago, I had finalized the quiet purchase of that $100 million property, saving it from foreclosure. "Transfer the deed from our joint trust directly into my sole corporate LLC," I ordered. "The paperwork is already signed and notarized on my end. File it with the county clerk immediately. Beatrice has exactly zero legal right to be on my property." Exactly 1 hour later, Preston was standing inside a luxury boutique on Fifth Avenue. He had decided to make a quick stop before the rehearsal dinner to purchase a $200,000 Rolex watch as a wedding gift for Serena, using my money, of course. My phone lit up with an incoming call from his number. I answered and put it on speaker, pouring myself a fresh shot of espresso. Kira, what the hell is going on? Preston screamed into the phone, his voice pitching high with panic. I am standing at the register and my card was just declined. The manager is looking at me like I am a criminal. Fix this right now or I swear I will divorce you and take half of everything you own. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso. The dark, bitter taste of the expensive roast matched my current mood, perfectly settling the fire in my veins into a cold, calculated focus. You are absolutely right, Preston, I replied, echoing his exact tone from an hour earlier. Trash really should not mix with high society, and that includes my money. You wanted me out of your elite world, so I'm removing my funding from it entirely. Have fun walking home in your tuxedo. I hung up the phone, blocked his number, and prepared for the absolute destruction I was about to unleash on his entire family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who drastically underestimated your worth. The following morning, the sun rose over the spectacular $100 million Hamptons estate. The property was a sprawling architectural masterpiece featuring manicured gardens, private beach access, and a grand ballroom, perfectly suited for a high society wedding. Beatrice and Serena were standing on the expansive marble terrace barking vicious orders at a small army of florists, caterers, and event planners. They were entirely in their element, playing the role of wealthy aristocrats dictating the flow of the upcoming ceremony. Serena was sipping a mimosa, complaining loudly about the specific shade of white on the imported orchids, while Beatrice snapped her fingers at a server for not moving fast enough. Their delusion of grandeur was abruptly shattered by the sound of heavy diesel engines roaring up the private driveway. Three black tactical vehicles smashed through the open wrought iron gates, tires crunching aggressively against the gravel. A highly trained private security team, which I had personally contracted at a premium rate, poured out of the vehicles. They were dressed in sharp black uniforms, moving with absolute military precision. The security commander, a tall, imposing man named Vance, marched straight up the marble steps toward the terrace, ignoring the gasps of the terrified wedding vendors. Beatrice dropped her mimosa, glass the crystal shattering across the stone floor. What is the meaning of this? She shrieked, her face turning an ugly shade of red. Who let you in here? You are ruining the floral arrangements. My son bought this house. You work for us. I demand that you leave my property this instant before I call the local authorities and have you all arrested for trespassing. Commander Vance did not flinch. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bearing the official seal of the county clerk. He stepped forward and shoved the papers directly against Beatrice's chest, forcing her to grab them or let them fall. You do not own this property, ma'am, Vance stated, his voice booming across the terrace so every single vendor could hear him. This estate is solely owned by a corporate entity managed by Kira. I am serving you with an immediate, legally binding eviction notice. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises before my team physically removes you and your belongings from the grounds. Serena let out a high-pitched scream of pure outrage. You cannot do this, she yelled, stomping her foot like a spoiled toddler. My wedding is tomorrow. My groom's family is flying in from Washington, D.C. today. Jamal is going to be here any minute. We are the elite class of this town. We run this community. Beatrice grabbed her daughter's arm, her chest heaving as she read over the eviction notice. Her eyes bulged as the reality of the legal document set in, but her arrogance completely overrode her logic. This is impossible, Beatrice yelled, waving the papers in the air. I let that peasant marry my son specifically because she promised to fund our lifestyle. I lowered my family's historic standards to accept a rural, uneducated software developer into our bloodline, and this is how she repays us. By throwing us out of our own ancestral home. Vance crossed his arms, thoroughly unimpressed by her frantic outburst. He turned his attention away from Beatrice and looked directly at the crowd of frozen wedding vendors. Attention all contractors, Vance announced loudly. The individual who was financing your services has officially withdrawn all funding. The catering, the floral arrangements, the audio equipment, and the staging have all been canceled due to non-payment. I highly suggest you pack up your equipment and leave immediately, because the people standing on this terrace have absolutely zero funds to pay your invoices. Absolute chaos erupted across the estate. The florist immediately began snatching back the expensive imported orchids, tossing them carelessly into cardboard boxes. The caterers started rolling away carts of expensive champagne and hors d'oeuvres, ignoring Serena, who was literally pulling on their sleeves, begging them to stay. The grand illusion of the billionaire family was disintegrating in real time, exposed for the empty, bankrupt shell it truly was. Beatrice was hyperventilating, clutching a stone pillar for support while Serena wailed about her ruined wedding day. Just as the last catering truck was backing out of the driveway, a silver Porsche careened through the gates, skidding wildly before slamming to a halt near the security vehicles. Preston jumped out of the driver's seat, his hair disheveled, and his designer suit rumpled from apparently sleeping in his car after I stranded him in Manhattan the night before. He saw the security team, saw the vendors leaving, and completely lost whatever fragile grip he had left on his sanity. Preston sprinted up the stairs and violently shoved one of the security guards. "What are you doing to my mother's house?" Preston roared, spit flying from his lips. "I am going to sue every single one of you." He ripped his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking violently as he dialed my number. I answered on the first ring, sitting comfortably in my office chair, watching the entire scene unfold through the live feed of the security cameras I had installed around the property. "You psychotic witch!" Preston screamed into the phone, not caring who heard him. "You actually think you can evict my mother? You think you can ruin my sister's wedding? I am your husband. I own 50% of your company through our post-nuptial agreement. You are legally bound to me. I will take half your wealth, destroy your business, and leave you with absolutely nothing." I leaned into the microphone on my desk, ensuring my voice was perfectly clear and terrifyingly calm through his car's Bluetooth system, which was currently broadcasting my response across the entire driveway. 50% of what Preston asked, letting a dangerous silence follow my question. "Do you mean 50% of the domestic shell company we set up? Or do you mean the hidden Cayman Island accounts you have been secretly embezzling my corporate funds into for the last 2 years?" Preston froze instantly, the color completely draining from his face as the realization hit him like a freight train. He dropped his phone, the device clattering against the gravel driveway as the full weight of his impending destruction finally dawned on him. The dull thud of Preston dropping his phone echoed through my computer speakers. I watched his frozen figure on my security feed for a few seconds before closing the laptop. There was no joy in seeing the man I married crumble in a graveled driveway, only a cold, clinical satisfaction. I had a company to run. I turned my attention back to my quarterly projections, expecting the rats to scurry and hide. I underestimated their desperation. By noon, my chief public relations officer burst into my office. She threw a tablet onto my desk, her face pale. Beatrice and Serena had gone nuclear. Forced out of the Hamptons estate, they had retreated to a cramped bridal suite at a lesser hotel and recorded a live video. I hit play. Serena was front and center, her mascara perfectly smudged to look like she had been crying for hours. Beatrice hovered behind her, clutching a tissue to her chest in a theatrical display of maternal anguish. Serena stared directly into the camera, her voice trembling with practiced vulnerability. She told her thousands of followers that her sister-in-law was suffering from a severe psychotic break. She claimed I was insanely jealous of her upcoming marriage to a prominent neurosurgeon. According to Serena, I had stopped taking my medication, locked my husband out of his own bank accounts, and used illegal security forces to hijack their ancestral home just 24 hours before her wedding. The video was a masterclass in manipulation. She painted herself as the innocent bride, a victim of my unhinged vendetta against their legacy family. The internet devoured it. Within 2 hours, the video hit 3 million views. Comments flooded my company's social media pages, demanding I step down as chief executive officer. People called me toxic crazy and a bitter new money tyrant trying to destroy a beautiful family. My public relations officer frantically suggested we issue an immediate cease and desist or draft a press release defending my mental health. I shook my head, handing the tablet back to her. "Let them talk," I instructed calmly. When your enemy is digging their own grave, you do not take away their shovel. Just monitor the stock drop. We will buy back shares when they hit rock bottom today. While the internet burned with misplaced outrage, the groom was busy paying attention to the real world. Jamal was a brilliant man. You do not become a top-tier neurosurgeon in Washington, D.C. by ignoring the details. Coming from a deeply respected, highly educated African-American family, he understood the weight of reputation and the stench of a lie. Jamal had seen the video, but instead of rushing to comfort his sobbing bride, he noticed the glaring inconsistencies. He recognized that the so-called ancestral Hamptons estate had recently been listed in a commercial real estate auction. He noticed Serena dodging questions about why the wedding vendors were suddenly demanding cash up front. Instead of calling Serena, Jamal bypassed her entirely. At 2 in the afternoon, my office doors opened again. My assistant tried to stop him, but Jamal stepped into my office, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression impossible to read. He closed the door behind him, shutting out the frantic noise of my corporate headquarters. We had only met a handful of times, mostly at awkward family dinners, where Beatrice spent the entire evening making thinly veiled, racist microaggressions disguised as compliments about his articulation. I always respected how he handled her ignorance with sharp, polite boundaries. Jamal did not sit down. He walked up to my desk and placed both hands on the glass surface. "I am not here to talk about viral videos or mental health rumors," he said, his voice deep and authoritative. "I am a surgeon. I operate on facts. My fiancée is currently screaming at a hotel manager because her credit card bounced. Her brother is nowhere to be found. Her mother is begging my parents for a short-term loan to cover a rehearsal dinner. I want to know exactly what is going on, Kira. And I want the truth." I appreciated a man who did not waste time. I did not offer him a seat, and I did not give him a tearful explanation about my marriage falling apart. I simply unlocked my bottom desk drawer and pulled out a thin manila folder. I opened it and slid 3 pieces of paper across the desk toward him. The first document was the bank wire transfer confirmation from 5 days ago. Jamal picked it, his eyes scanning the numbers. It was the $100 million payment for the Hamptons estate, originating from my sole corporate account, bearing my signature alone. Preston's name was nowhere on it. He lied about owning the property, I stated plainly. His family has been bankrupt for a decade. I bought the house. Today I evicted them. Jamal's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, setting the paper down. I slid the second document forward. It was a paid invoice from a specialized surgical center in Maryland. 3 months ago, Jamal's mother had undergone an expensive specialized spinal procedure. Serena had proudly bragged to his entire family that she paid the staggering out-of-pocket costs using her own private charity fund as a welcoming gift to her new mother-in-law. Jamal looked at the payment origin. It matched my corporate account perfectly. "Serena does not have a charity fund," I explained softly. "She begged my husband to force me into paying it so she could impress your family." Jamal exhaled slowly, the betrayal visibly settling into his shoulders. He reached for the third and final piece of paper. It was a stack of high-resolution photographs taken by the private investigator I hired when I first suspected Preston was moving my money. The investigator had followed the entire family. The top photo showed Serena in the parking lot of a luxury gym just 2 days ago. She was pressed against a luxury sports car, aggressively kissing her personal trainer. The subsequent photos showed them walking into a hotel together. The silence in my office was deafening. Jamal stared at the photographs for a long, agonizing minute. The illusion of the perfect high society bride had just shattered completely. He was a man of logic and precision, and the empirical evidence of her deceit was undeniable. He had been used for his family's prestige, lied to about her finances, and betrayed days before he was supposed to stand at an altar. Suddenly, the sharp ringing of a cell phone pierced the quiet room. Jamal pulled his phone from his inner jacket pocket. The screen lit up with an incoming call. The caller identification displayed Serena's name, accompanied by a heart emoji. He stared at the ringing phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. He did not answer. He pressed the side button, silencing the call and slipping the device back into his pocket. Jamal finally looked up from the photographs and met my eyes. The warmth and polite charm he usually carried were completely gone, replaced by a cold, surgical calculation. He adjusted his jacket, perfectly composed, despite the total destruction of his future marriage. "Do you have a dress for tomorrow?" Jamal asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Because I'm going to need a reliable ally to burn this wedding to the ground." I smiled at Jamal and calmly told him I had the perfect dress for tomorrow. The alliance was formed in an instant, bound by absolute betrayal and cold calculation. While we prepared our strategy, panic was rapidly consuming my husband's family. Preston had spent the afternoon frantically scrambling to secure a new venue for the rehearsal dinner. His crumbling elite facade required a truly lavish setting to impress Jamal's distinguished parents, who had just flown in from the capital. With his black cards frozen and his mother's accounts empty, Preston turned to the darkest corner of his network. He secured a massive predatory loan from a notorious underground syndicate, putting up fake collateral just to rent out the prestigious Oakwood Golf Club for the evening. He thought he was buying enough time to fix his complete financial ruin. He had no idea he was just building his own scaffold. The Oakwood Golf Club was the pinnacle of old money arrogance, featuring sprawling greens and members-only dining rooms that reeked of exclusivity. It was exactly the kind of place Beatrice used to remind me that I did not belong. Now they were using borrowed criminal money to sip vintage champagne under its crystal chandeliers, pretending their empire was not actively burning to the ground. Inside the club's private banquet hall, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Jamal sat at the head of the table, next to Serena, playing the role of the devoted fiancé flawlessly. His parents, a formidable federal judge and a renowned university dean, sat opposite Beatrice. Beatrice was leaning across the white linen tablecloth, clutching her wine glass, already spinning her web of lies. She dabbed at dry eyes and whispered conspiratorially to Jamal's mother about my absence. "It breaks my heart to say this," Beatrice murmured, projecting false sympathy. "But Kira has suffered a complete mental breakdown. She locked herself in her room and refused to take her medication. Preston is simply devastated by his wife's psychotic episode, but we are doing our best to handle her rural, unstable upbringing." Serena nodded along, resting her head on Jamal's shoulder, playing the stressed but brave bride. Jamal simply offered a polite, tight-lipped smile, knowing perfectly well that the woman his fiancée was calling insane had just handed him high-resolution photos of Serena kissing another man. He checked his watch. The trap was set. The heavy mahogany doors of the banquet hall swung open. Conversations died instantly as every head turned toward the entrance. I walked into the room wearing a breathtaking emerald green gown that swept across the polished hardwood floor. I wore no jewelry, needing no diamonds to command the space. The raw authority in my posture was enough to freeze the blood in Preston's veins. I walked past the shocked waiters and stopped directly at the head of the table. Beatrice shot up from her chair so fast it tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "What is the absolute meaning of this?" she screeched, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "How did you get past security?" Preston lunged to his feet, his face pale and sweating profusely as he stepped between me and Jamal's family. "Kira, you are having an episode," he stammered frantically, trying to maintain his manufactured narrative. "You need to leave right now before you embarrass yourself further." I did not even look at him. I kept my gaze locked on Beatrice. Beatrice wildly waved her arms at the venue staff gathered near the kitchen doors. "Manager," she yelled, snapping her fingers aggressively. "Get over here immediately. I demand you remove this trespasser from the premises. Call the police. She is a danger to my guests." The general manager of the Oakwood Golf Club slowly stepped forward from the dark shadows of the hallway. He was a stern, uncompromising man who had managed the elite property for 2 decades. Beatrice smiled triumphantly, expecting him to grab my arm and drag me out into the cold night air. Instead, the manager walked straight past Beatrice, completely ignoring her frantic commands. He stopped 2 feet in front of me, bowed his head respectfully, and extended a thick leather-bound ledger. "The monthly financial reports you requested, Ms. Kira," he said, his voice ringing out clearly across the dead-silent room. "We have also prepared the employee retention files for your review." Beatrice gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. You cannot serve her, Beatrice shrieked. My son rented this hall. The manager finally turned to look at my mother-in-law, his expression entirely devoid of warmth. Your son rented a room, madam, Ms. Kira bought the entire country club this morning. She is the sole owner of this property. The collective gasp from Jamal's family was audible. Serena dropped her fork, her mouth hanging open as her entire illusion collapsed in real time. I took the ledger from the general manager and calmly smiled at Beatrice. You were right about one thing, Beatrice. I do not belong in your elite clubs, so I decided to just buy them and change the dress code. Preston was hyperventilating now, his chest heaving as the reality of his massive illegal loan closed in on him. He realized he had just borrowed dangerous money to rent a room in a building I now owned. But Preston was a cornered animal, and desperate cornered animals bite blindly. He reached into his tailored jacket, his hands trembling violently as he pulled out a thick legal document. You like playing games? He roared, his voice cracking with desperate, malicious energy. You think you can buy your way out of this marriage? I just triggered the corporate buyout clause in our post-nuptial agreement. He slammed the heavy document onto the table directly over my brand new ledger. You are officially fired from your own board, Kira. Sign it right now, you arrogant fraud. Preston stood over the mahogany table, his chest heaving with triumphant breaths as he shoved the heavy legal document directly into my personal space. He looked around the packed banquet hall, making absolutely sure Jamal and his distinguished parents were watching his pathetic display of power. You actually thought you could outsmart a family that has been running this state for generations, Preston sneered, adjusting his tailored jacket. I had my lawyers draft that post-nuptial agreement 3 years ago. You never noticed the arbitration clause buried on page 42. Beatrice suddenly regained her posture. She smoothed down her designer dress and stepped forward, a vicious smile spreading across her face. You rural trash, Beatrice hissed. You really thought you could walk into our world and dictate terms. My son is a financial genius. He has been systematically dismantling your pathetic little software empire for months. I did not touch the pen. Preston shoved toward me. I simply looked at the document, then back at my husband. He slammed his hand against the ledger. I transferred the core patent rights of your supply chain software to a subsidiary holding company in the Cayman Islands last week, Preston announced loudly. According to corporate law and the post-nuptial clause you signed, any asset transferred into that specific entity falls under my exclusive voting control. I hold 51% of the international branch. You are completely locked out of your own intellectual property, Kira. Sign the termination papers and walk out of here, or I will liquidate the patents tomorrow and leave you with absolute zero. Serena let out a high-pitched squeal of delight. Jamal remained completely rigid, his face an impenetrable mask as he watched the scene unfold. See, Jamal, she cooed, gazing up at him. I told you my brother was a brilliant businessman. We are protecting our family assets from a gold digger. Jamal took a deliberate step away from her, aligning himself closer to me. His parents, seated in the front row, maintained a stony, terrifying silence. They were observing the total implosion of the bride's family with the analytical precision of a leading surgeon and a strict federal judge. I looked at the termination papers, then at the pen, and finally up at Preston. I reached into my clutch. I did not pull out a lawyer's business card. I did not pull out a checkbook. I pulled out my mobile phone. I dialed a special number. I tapped the speakerphone icon and set the device right on top of Preston's termination document. The line rang twice. A crisp voice echoed through the banquet hall. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division, Special Agent Hayes speaking. State your emergency or tip. Beatrice gasped, taking a sudden step backward. Preston's arrogant smile faltered his eyes, darting frantically to the phone on the table. Hang up that phone right now, Preston demanded, his voice cracking slightly. He reached across the table to grab the device, but Jamal moved with lightning speed, blocking Preston's hand with a firm, uncompromising grip. Let the woman make her phone call, Jamal stated, his deep voice leaving zero room for debate. I leaned down towards the microphone. Agent Hayes, this is Kira. I am calling to confirm that the international wire transfer we have been monitoring for the past 48 hours has successfully cleared, confirmed Kira. The federal agent replied, his voice booming over the speaker. We tracked the final deposit hitting the offshore Cayman Island account at exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon. Preston staggered backward as if he had been struck. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, ghostly white. "What are you doing?" he whispered, terror creeping into his eyes. I kept my gaze locked on my husband, letting the reality of his destruction sink into his bones. You are not a financial genius, Preston. You are a predictable, greedy parasite. I knew about the Cayman Islands subsidiary the moment you registered it 12 months ago. Did you think a software CEO who builds global tracking systems would miss a fraudulent shell company attached to her own patent portfolio? I stood up straight, projecting my voice, so every elite guest in the room could hear the absolute finality in my words. I let you siphon the funds because civil divorce disputes are messy and take years in court. I needed you to commit a federal crime, so I intentionally removed the security protocols on my secondary accounts. I gave you a clear path to steal exactly $10 million and transfer it across international borders. You just escalated a boring marital dispute into a felony of international wire fraud. Beatrice let out a strangled cry, grabbing her chest. Serena stared in horror, looking desperately at Jamal for support, but Jamal was busy adjusting his cufflinks, looking entertained by the bloodbath. Preston tried to force a laugh. It sounded weak, pathetic, and bordering on hysterical. You have absolutely no proof of any of this, Kira. He pointed a finger at me. My accountant is a professional. He wiped the servers clean the second the transfer cleared. There is no digital footprint tying me to that offshore account. You are bluffing to save face. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply raised my hand and pointed toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the country club. Outside the glass, the manicured golf course was suddenly illuminated by a rhythmic flashing. Intense beams of red and blue police lights cut through the darkness, illuminating the terrified faces of the wedding guests. Dozens of heavily armored federal vehicles were blocking the main entrance, their sirens intentionally silenced. I looked back at Preston, watching his miserable soul completely leave his trembling body as reality finally set in. I did not need your servers, Preston, I said softly, delivering the final fatal blow. I own the routing software your accountant used to move the money. Federal agents poured into the banquet hall with ruthless efficiency. They did not care about the crystal chandeliers or the expensive champagne. Preston was handcuffed instantly, his arms wrenched behind his back in front of the horrified elite guests he had tried so desperately to impress. Beatrice shrieked, clutching her designer pearls, demanding the federal officers release her son. The crushing reality of the situation finally broke through her arrogance. The corporate takeover had failed. Her ancestral home was gone. The bank accounts were frozen solid. The only liquid cash Preston had access to was the dangerous, exorbitant cash advance he had secured from the underground syndicate just hours prior to rent the country club. Standing in the freezing parking lot of the property I now owned, Preston made a fatal, reckless calculation. He used the mob money to post his emergency federal bail, draining the very last drop of his illegal capital to keep himself out of a holding cell for the night. Back at their cramped, downgraded hotel suite, the atmosphere was suffocating. Beatrice paced the stained carpet, her manicured hands trembling violently. She looked at Serena, who was hyperventilating on the cheap fabric of the sofa. The family was officially destitute. The federal indictment would hit the morning news cycle, and the ensuing financial ruin would be absolute. Beatrice grabbed her daughter by the shoulders, her perfectly maintained high society facade cracking into pure, vicious survival instinct. The wedding cannot wait. Beatrice commanded, her voice dropping to a frantic, predatory whisper. Once Jamal and his parents see the federal charges on the morning broadcast, they will sever all ties. His family wealth is our only remaining lifeline. You are going to marry that neurosurgeon tomorrow morning. We will find a backup venue. We will say the country club had a catastrophic plumbing emergency. You will smile, walk down that aisle, and secure our access to his family accounts before he realizes we are bankrupt. Serena immediately grabbed her phone and called Jamal, sobbing her practiced theatrical tears. She fed him the exact lie Beatrice had constructed, blaming facility issues and begging to move the ceremony up to sunrise at a nearby botanical garden chapel to save their special day. Jamal, standing in his own luxury hotel suite across town, put the phone on speaker. He listened to her desperate manipulative performance with absolute surgical detachment. Coming from a lineage of sharp, intellectual power players, he knew exactly how to handle a cornered liar. He played his part flawlessly. He adopted the tone of a deeply concerned, unconditionally loving partner. He promised Serena he would handle his parents and ensure his entire family was ready by dawn. He told her to get some rest, assured her everything would be perfect, and softly said he loved her. The second he ended the call, Jamal picked up his secondary device. He typed a rapid, precise message to my secure line. The target moved the timeline to sunrise at the Botanical Chapel. Bring the gasoline. The morning sun barely crested the horizon as Serena stood inside the cramped, dimly lit bridal suite of the Botanical Garden. She stared at her reflection in the full-length mirror, frantically adjusting the intricate lace bodice of a $50,000 designer wedding gown. It was a masterpiece of haute couture acquired on a line of credit she could no longer pay from a boutique that would soon be hunting her down for collection. She practiced her innocent, blushing smile, desperately trying to mask the sheer terror radiating from her eyes. She knew the clock was ticking against her family. Beatrice had stationed herself outside to intercept the groom and ensure the swift progression of the ceremony. Serena smoothed down the expensive silk, taking shallow breaths to calm her racing heart. She told herself that once the vows were spoken, her financial security would be permanently locked in. Jamal would be bound to her, and his prestigious name would shield them from the coming storm. Her entire future depended on maintaining this perfect, innocent illusion for just one more hour. The pressure in the room was palpable, suffocating her with the weight of her own deceit. She practiced her vows in the mirror, rehearsing the lies she planned to deliver at the altar. The heavy wooden door of the suite swung shut. The deadbolt slid into place with a sharp metallic snap that echoed through the quiet room. Serena spun around, expecting her mother or the frantic makeup artist arriving to fix her ruined mascara. I stepped out of the shadows of the room, blocking the only exit. I wore a tailored black suit, completely out of place for a joyous wedding celebration, but absolutely perfect for a corporate execution. Serena let out a sharp gasp, her face contorting with instantaneous rage. The innocent bride persona vanished, replaced by the ugly, entitled fury she had inherited from Beatrice. She had spent her entire privileged existence believing she could manipulate her way out of any consequence, assuming her prestigious last name provided immunity from the damage she inflicted on others. She glared at me, her chest heaving as she processed my presence. She truly believed her brother's pathetic corporate maneuvers would have broken my spirit. She did not realize I had spent the last 10 years ruthlessly tearing down competitors far more intelligent than her bankrupt relatives. I stood perfectly still, offering her no reaction, letting my absolute silence amplify the sheer panic rising rapidly in her throat. She took a threatening step forward, her false elegance completely abandoned now. "You ruined my family," Serena hissed, storming across the room and raising her hand to strike my face. I caught her wrist effortlessly in midair, my grip tightening like a vice against her fragile bones. "Careful, bride," I whispered, stepping close enough for her to see the absolute destruction in my eyes. "Your groom knows exactly how many times you slept with your trainer this week." Serena ripped her wrist from my grasp, stumbling backward into the vanity. She stared at me, her face twisting into a feral sneer. "You are lying," she spat, her voice shaking. "Jamal would never believe a bitter, jealous ex-wife over me. You are just the rural trash my brother is divorcing." I smoothed my black suit. I did not have to tell him anything. "The investigator I hired caught your gym romance on camera." I handed Jamal the photographs. "Your groom knows everything." Serena gasped as reality crashed down. She lunged forward, begging. "Kira, please," she sobbed, grabbing my sleeves. "You cannot do this to me. If Jamal leaves, my family has nothing. Preston lost all our money. We will be on the street. I will do anything. Just let me marry him." Before I could respond, the wooden door flew open. Beatrice stormed inside, flanked by two massive security guards. She looked possessed, her eyes wild until they locked onto me. "Get this woman out of my sight!" Beatrice screeched, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "She is trespassing. Remove her right now." The guards stepped forward, but I raised my hand, stopping them. "I am leaving, Beatrice," I said, walking past the security detail. "I just came to wish the bride luck. She is going to need a lot of it today." Beatrice ignored me, hauling Serena upright. "Stop crying and fix your face," Beatrice hissed. "The wedding march is starting. Jamal is waiting at the altar. You will walk down that aisle, smile for the cameras, and secure his family accounts before the bank seizes my car. Do you understand me?" Serena nodded, frantically wiping her ruined makeup and forcing a rigid, terrifying smile onto her face. I walked out of the suite and took my place on the upper balcony overlooking the Botanical Garden Chapel. The venue was packed with hundreds of elite guests, all completely unaware of the absolute destruction hovering just above their heads. The string quartet began playing the wedding march, the melodic notes floating through the crisp morning air. The heavy double doors at the back of the chapel swung open, and Serena stepped into the sunlight. She looked like a vision of high society perfection, clad in her $50,000 stolen gown. She glided down the aisle, beaming at the crowd, playing the role of the innocent, deeply in love bride. But from my vantage point, I could see the rigid tension in her shoulders and the panicked darting of her eyes. She was walking toward a financial lifeline, completely unaware that she was actually marching toward an execution. I shifted my gaze to the front row. Jamal's family sat in absolute terrifying silence. His parents, the prominent federal judge, and the university dean did not smile. They did not whisper to each other. They sat perfectly straight, their faces chiseled from stone, radiating a cold, uncompromising authority. They knew exactly what was about to happen. They had reviewed the financial documents and the photographs I provided. They were simply waiting for the trap to spring shut. At the altar, the contrast was almost comical. Preston stood in his role as a groomsman, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot. Sweat poured down his face, soaking the collar of his expensive tuxedo. He was completely ignoring his sister's grand entrance, staring obsessively at the glowing screen of his mobile phone. He was frantically refreshing his banking apps, watching in real time as his offshore accounts were frozen by federal warrants. The panic radiating from him was palpable. I knew the authorities were closing in, but he was trapped at the altar, forced to play a role in a wedding that was already dead. Serena finally reached the end of the aisle. She stepped up onto the altar and took Jamal's hands. She offered him a bright, tearful smile, pouring every ounce of her manipulative energy into the performance. Jamal looked down at her. His expression was flawless. He offered a polite, gentle smile in return, his hands holding hers with a steady, surgical calm. He played the devoted groom with such terrifying perfection that for a fleeting second Serena actually relaxed, believing she had gotten away with everything. The elderly priest stepped forward, opening his ornate leather book. He cleared his throat and projected his voice across the quiet, sunlit chapel. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his words echoing over the gathered crowd. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Jamal and Serena in holy matrimony, a bond built on trust, honesty, and unwavering devotion." Serena gazed up at Jamal, her eyes shining with fake adoration. Preston wiped his sweating forehead with a handkerchief, his phone buzzing violently in his pocket, with what was undoubtedly another automated fraud alert from his Cayman Island bank. Beatrice stood in the front row, clutching her designer purse, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. "If anyone here has cause to object to this union," the priest continued, unaware of the impending bloodbath, "speak now, or forever hold your peace." The chapel remained completely silent. The birds chirped in the botanical gardens. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves. Serena let out a tiny, almost imperceptible sigh of relief. Then Jamal moved. He slowly released Serena's hands. He took a deliberate step backward, creating chilling distance between them. Serena's fake smile faltered, confusion flashing across her face. Jamal turned his head and looked directly at the priest. He raised his right hand flat, an uncompromising gesture that demanded absolute silence. The priest stopped reading instantly, his mouth hanging open in complete shock. Jamal reached into his tailored tuxedo jacket. He did not pull out a velvet ring box. He pulled out a wireless microphone. He clicked the power switch, a sharp pop echoing through the chapel. Jamal slowly turned his back on the altar. He faced the elite guests, locking eyes with his parents, who gave him a single nod of approval. "I would like to thank every single one of you for attending today." Jamal began, his voice echoing through the silent chapel with terrifying calm. He did not sound like a man whose heart was broken. He sounded like a brilliant surgeon explaining a fatal inoperable diagnosis to a patient. "You were invited here to witness a sacred union built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect. Unfortunately, the bride and her family have a very different definition of those words. They view marriage not as a partnership, but as a hostile financial takeover." Serena reached out, her hands trembling violently as she lunged forward, trying to grab the microphone from his grip. Jamal simply took a smooth, calculated step out of her reach, his eyes never leaving the crowd. He pulled a small black remote from his tailored pocket and pressed a single button. The massive digital screens flanking the altar, which were supposed to display a romantic, carefully curated slideshow of their relationship, flickered to life. A collective gasp ripped through the audience. Projected in high definition for every elite guest to see were the photographs I had handed Jamal yesterday. There was Serena pressed aggressively against her personal trainer in a luxury gym parking lot. The next slide clicked over, showing the two of them walking hand in hand into a cheap hotel. Then another image flashed across the screen, showing them intertwined in the front seat of a sports car just 48 hours ago. Serena let out a guttural, horrifying wail and dropped heavily to her knees. Her $50,000 stolen wedding gown pooled around her on the marble altar as she buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Jamal did not even look down at her. "I am a man of science," Jamal continued, his voice cutting cleanly over Serena's frantic sobbing. "I require empirical evidence before making life-altering decisions. The evidence presented on these screens clearly illustrates my fiancé has been occupied with someone else. But the deception does not stop with her infidelity. The rot in this twisted family goes straight to the very roots." Jamal pressed the remote again. The screens faded to black and an audio file began playing over the chapel surround sound system. It was a recording Jamal had captured on his phone that morning while standing unnoticed outside the bridal suite. Beatrice's incredibly sharp, highly venomous voice filled the entire room. "I do not care about their Washington degrees," the recorded voice of Beatrice sneered. "They are just jumping the line because of diversity quotas. We locked down his bank accounts today and never have to deal with his stuck-up relatives again. We are the elite bloodline here. They should be extremely grateful." The silence in the massive chapel was absolute. Jamal's parents did not flinch. His mother, the federal judge, simply adjusted her glasses, looking at Beatrice with sheer aristocratic disdain. Jamal's father crossed his arms, his expression unreadable but terrifyingly severe. Beatrice realized her social execution was finalized. Seeing no other way out of the crushing humiliation, she threw a hand against her forehead, let out a theatrical gasp, and collapsed onto the polished floor, pretending to faint. Not a single person moved to help her. The entire congregation sat frozen, utterly captivated by it. Preston finally snapped completely. The sheer pressure of the frozen offshore accounts, the incoming federal indictment, and the total public destruction of his family pushed him right over the edge. His face turned a volatile shade of crimson. "You ruined everything," Preston roared, abandoning any remaining shred of sanity. He lunged across the altar, aiming a punch directly at Jamal's head. Jamal did not even brace for impact. From the front row, his two older brothers moved with terrifying, highly coordinated speed. Malik and Tyrell were both former military officers. They vaulted onto the altar before Preston could close the distance. Malik caught Preston's swinging arm, twisting it sharply behind his back. Tyrell swept Preston's legs out from under him with a swift, punishing kick. Preston hit the marble steps of the altar with a sickening thud. The two brothers pinned him face down against the cold stone, pressing their heavy knees into his back with effortless, professional precision. Preston thrashed wildly, screaming obscenities into the marble floor, but he was completely immobilized, trapped like a captured animal. Jamal straightened his tie, utterly unbothered by the violence that had just erupted inches from him. He looked down at Preston writhing on the steps, then turned his attention back to Serena, who was still weeping hysterically on the floor. "The wedding is officially cancelled," Jamal stated, his voice resonating with absolute finality. "You can keep the ring, Serena. You are going to need the pawn value to survive the week." He crouched down slightly, ensuring his next words were delivered directly into her face. "My family ran a deep background check on your brother last night after Kira provided the financial documents. We found out exactly how Preston secured the funds to rent out the country club yesterday." Serena stopped crying for a fraction of a second, looking up at him with ruined, terrified eyes. "He borrowed $500,000 from an unlicensed, highly dangerous underground lending syndicate," Jamal explained softly. "But Preston is currently facing federal wire fraud charges, meaning his credit is completely toxic. He needed a clean guarantor to secure the cash advance. Since your mother has no assets left, he used the only other person in his immediate family." Serena shook her head frantically, her breath catching in her throat. "No," she whispered. "I never signed anything." Jamal offered her a completely cold, incredibly razor-sharp smile. "I know that you did not. But the syndicate holding the debt does not care. Preston forged your signature on the guarantor contract to get the cash. You are legally on the hook for $500,000 of criminal debt. Good luck with that, Serena." The revelation of the forged syndicate loan hit Serena like a physical blow. She collapsed onto the polished marble floor of the altar, clutching the tulle of her unpaid wedding gown, screaming hysterically about hitmen and bankruptcy. The elite guests in the Botanical Garden Chapel did not wait for another slide in Jamal's presentation. Hundreds of wealthy attendees who just moments ago had been sipping pre-ceremony champagne scrambled over mahogany pews and sprinted for the exits. Expensive high heels were abandoned on the grass outside as socialites shoved each other out of the way. Over the frantic screams of the fleeing guests and Serena's hyperventilating sobs, a loud, definitive crash echoed through the venue. The heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel were thrust open with violent, uncompromising force. A tactical unit did not just walk into the room. They marched. They were not the local town police or regional state troopers. Federal agents had arrived. They did not care about the exclusive guest list or the sacred nature of the botanical gardens. Their heavy boots thudded against the hardwood floor in perfect, terrifying unison, cutting a direct path straight down the center aisle littered with discarded wedding programs. Preston was still pinned face down against the altar steps by Malik and Tyrell. His desperate struggles ceased the second he saw the federal badges reflecting the morning sunlight. The lead marshal, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face carved from granite, stepped up to the altar. He did not ask questions. He did not politely request compliance. He looked at Jamal's brothers, who immediately stepped back, relinquishing their grip on the struggling groom's brother. The marshal grabbed Preston by the collar of his ruined designer tuxedo and hauled him to his feet with effortless, brutal strength. Preston's legs wobbled, his expensive leather shoes sliding uselessly against the marble. "Preston, you are under arrest for international wire fraud, federal embezzlement, and multiple counts of aggravated forgery," the marshal announced. His voice boomed across the rapidly emptying chapel, carrying the absolute uncompromising weight of the federal government. "You have the right to remain silent, and I highly suggest you use it." The metallic click echoed sharply, acting as the final nail in the coffin of his elite facade. Preston wept openly, his arrogant corporate persona entirely dissolved, replaced by the pathetic whimpers of a man who realized he would spend the next 2 decades in a federal penitentiary. The sharp sound of his handcuffs snapping shut possessed a miraculous, almost biblical healing power. Beatrice, who had been lying on the floor in her dramatic, entirely fabricated fainting spell, suddenly sprang to her feet. Her miraculous resurrection was fueled by pure, unadulterated panic. The maternal devotion she had faked for decades vanished in a heartbeat. Beatrice looked wildly around the chapel, her eyes darting from the federal agents to her sobbing daughter on the floor, and finally up to the second-floor balcony. She spotted me standing there, leaning casually against the brass railing in my tailored black suit, watching the demolition of her family with quiet satisfaction. "You did this!" she screeched, pointing a manicured, trembling finger up at the balcony. Her voice cracked with venom and sheer terror. You orchestrated this entire spectacle to ruin my beautiful family. You set my brilliant son up to fail." She abandoned all decorum, stomping her heels against the ground. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic yelling. I simply looked down at her and offered a small, terrifyingly cold smile. "I did not force your son to steal $10 million, Beatrice. I just provided him the rope. He tied the knot all by himself." Beatrice spun around to face the lead federal agent. She pointed directly at her own flesh and blood. "It was him," Beatrice screamed, her voice completely devoid of any maternal loyalty. She threw Preston under the bus, sacrificing her favorite child without a single second of hesitation. "My son did it all. He orchestrated the wire transfers. He set up the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I am just a poor, clueless widow. I knew absolutely nothing about his illegal business dealings. You have to believe me, he acted completely alone." Preston stopped whimpering. The betrayal from the mother he had bankrupted himself to please hit him harder than the federal charges. He turned his head, his tear-stained face twisting into a mask of pure, vicious hatred. He glared at Beatrice, the last shred of their elite family loyalty incinerating on the altar. "You knew nothing!" Preston roared, spittle flying from his lips as he strained against the heavy grip of the federal agents. "You are the one who begged me to steal the money. You signed the shell company documents to hide the stolen funds so you could maintain your pathetic country club lifestyle. I have your forged signatures on every single offshore tax evasion form from the last 3 years. You were the primary beneficiary of the Cayman Island accounts." Beatrice froze, the color completely draining from her face, leaving her a sickly, ghostly white. Her entire world, built on decades of deceit, entitlement, and stolen wealth, was collapsing in a spectacular, inescapable public execution. She opened her mouth to deny the accusations, to spin another web of lies, but no words came out. The absolute silence in the chapel was deafening. The lead marshal slowly turned his gaze away from Preston and locked his steely, uncompromising eyes on Beatrice. He reached to the back of his tactical belt. The sharp scrape of metal filled the air as he pulled out a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs. He took a deliberate, heavy step toward my mother-in-law. "Beatrice," the marshal stated, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying finality, "you have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it right now." The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around Beatrice's wrists, producing a sharp metallic snap that echoed through the stunned silence of the Botanical Garden Chapel. The lead marshal did not entertain her frantic, screeching protests. He simply spun her around and marched her straight down the aisle right behind her, sobbing, completely broken son. Preston did not look back. Beatrice kept screaming about her legacy, her ancestors, and her absolute innocence, but her shrieks faded into pathetic whimpers as the federal agents shoved them both through the heavy oak doors and out into the waiting armored vehicles. The chapel fell into a suffocating, terrifying quiet. The remaining elite guests had already fled, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire of a federal raid. The floral arrangements, towering displays of imported white orchids, stood as silent witnesses to the total eradication of an arrogant dynasty. Serena remained exactly where she had collapsed. She knelt on the polished marble floor of the altar, drowning in layers of her $50,000 entirely unpaid designer wedding gown. Her perfect bridal makeup was completely ruined, dark streaks of mascara running down her face as she hyperventilated. Her mother was gone. Her brother was in federal custody. Her groom had publicly annihilated her. The immense wealth she thought she had securely locked down was nothing but smoke. Before Serena could even attempt to stand up, the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel swung open for a third time. The men who walked into the sunlight were not federal agents. They were not straggling wedding guests. There were 3 of them, moving with a heavy, menacing synchronization. They wore cheap, ill-fitting suits that bulged unnaturally around their shoulders and waistlines. Their faces were hardened, marked by years of ruthless, violent debt collection. They did not care about the pristine beauty of the venue. They marched down the center aisle, their heavy boots trampling right over the discarded wedding programs and crushed flower petals. The man leading the trio stopped at the base of the altar. He had a thick, scarred jaw. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a wrinkled, heavily folded document. He looked down at the weeping bride. "Serena," the man stated. His voice was a harsh, gravelly rumble that sent an immediate shiver down my spine from where I stood on the balcony. He did not ask a question. He delivered a fact. You are having a very bad morning. It is about to get significantly worse. Serena scrambled backward, her expensive heels slipping against the marble. She clutched the tulle of her dress to her chest. "Who are you?" she stammered, her voice pitching high with absolute terror. "You cannot be in here. This is a private event." The man let out a short, humorless laugh. "Your brother Preston visited our establishment yesterday. He was extremely desperate to rent a country club. He borrowed exactly $500,000 in cash. Our terms are highly specific, Serena. We do not do extensions. We do not do payment plans. The principal plus interest was due at sunrise today. Since your brother is currently taking a ride in a federal transport van, we are here to collect from the guarantor." He tossed the wrinkled document directly onto Serena's lap. It was the loan contract. At the very bottom, next to Preston's frantic signature, was Serena's name perfectly forged as the sole financial guarantor. Serena stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. "I did not sign this," she shrieked, pushing the contract off her lap. "My brother forged my signature. You have to go after him. I do not have your money. I am broke." The debt collector stepped up onto the altar, invading her physical space. "Underground lending syndicates do not employ handwriting analysts," he growled, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. "We hold the paper. You hold the debt. We will give you exactly 24 hours to produce the $500,000 in cash. If you fail to deliver, we will start liquidating your physical assets. We will start with that dress on your back, then the car you drove here in, and then we will get creative." Total panic consumed Serena. She scrambled to her feet, tripping over her massive train, and desperately turned toward the front row. Jamal's family had not moved. His parents, the federal judge, and the university dean were calmly gathering their coats, completely unbothered by the criminal thugs standing just feet away. They had spent their entire careers dealing with the worst elements of society. Serena threw herself toward the front row, dropping to her knees right in front of Jamal's mother. Serena sobbed, grabbing the hem of the older woman's coat. "You have to help me. You have millions. $500,000 is nothing to your family. If you do not write them a check right now, these men are going to kill me. Please, I was supposed to be your daughter-in-law." Jamal's mother looked down at Serena with an expression of absolute chilling indifference. She did not flinch. She did not offer a comforting hand. She simply adjusted her glasses. "Your family spent the entire planning process of this wedding making crude racist jokes behind our backs," the judge stated, her voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. "You assumed our skin color made us inferior, while you secretly schemed to drain our bank accounts to fund your bankrupt, pathetic lifestyle. I do not bail out parasites." Jamal's mother calmly stepped right over Serena's sprawling, expensive wedding train. Jamal's father followed, not even glancing down. They walked straight down the aisle, completely ignoring the debt collectors, and exited the chapel, taking Serena's last remaining shred of hope with them. Serena was entirely out of options. The three large men closed in, blocking her path to the aisle. She was trapped on the altar, surrounded by the physical manifestation of her family's reckless greed. She slowly lifted her head, her mascara-stained eyes looking wildly around the empty room until they locked onto the second-floor balcony. She saw me standing there. The woman she had spent years calling rural trash. The woman she had mocked, belittled, and actively tried to destroy. Serena abandoned every last ounce of her false aristocratic pride. She fell forward, pressing her hands against the marble floor, and screamed up at the balcony. "Kira, please, I am begging you. You have billions. You can pay them off. I will do anything you want. Just do not let them take me." I looked down at the pathetic, broken bride. I did not smile. I simply turned and walked toward the grand staircase. My heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood stairs as I descended into the main chapel. The debt collectors turned to watch me approach, their hands instinctively dropping to their waistbands. I did not break stride. I walked straight up to the lead collector, the man with the scarred jaw. I opened my designer clutch. I reached inside and pulled out a crisp, pre-written cashier's check issued from my primary corporate account. I held the check between my index and middle fingers, extending it toward the heavy-set man. He looked at the paper, his eyes narrowing. He snatched it from my hand, inspecting the watermarks and the exact figure printed on the front. It was made out for exactly $500,000. The collector's harsh demeanor instantly evaporated. He let out a low whistle, clearly impressed by the immediate liquidity. He folded the check, tucked it securely into his suit jacket, and pulled the forged contract from his pocket. He handed the wrinkled document directly to me. "Pleasure doing business with you, ma'am," he muttered, tipping his head respectfully before signaling his men to leave. The three thugs marched out of the chapel, leaving behind a deafening silence. I stood on the altar, holding the physical proof of Serena's ultimate ruin. Serena let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. She tried to force a grateful smile, mistakenly believing that family loyalty had somehow compelled me to save her life. I slowly turned my head and looked directly into her terrified eyes. I held up the contract, displaying her forged signature. "The debt is paid," I stated, my voice echoing with terrifying authority. "Now transfer the collection rights to me." Serena's fragile smile instantly died. "You do not owe the mob anymore, Serena," I told her, stepping close enough to see the sheer horror paralyzing her entire body. "You owe me." Serena stared at the forged contract in my hand, her mouth opening and closing without a sound. The reality settled heavily over her ruined wedding dress. She was no longer a high society bride. She was an indentured servant to the very woman she had spent years trying to destroy. I did not wait for her to formulate an excuse. I turned on my heel and walked out of the Botanical Garden Chapel, leaving her alone on the marble altar to calculate exactly how many years of minimum wage labor it would take to pay off a $500,000 debt. The crisp morning air felt incredibly refreshing as I stepped into my waiting car. My phone was already vibrating endlessly with notifications. The social media firestorm had begun. By dawn the following day, the spectacular collapse of Preston's family was the leading story across every major news network and digital platform. Footage of federal agents dragging a tuxedo-clad Preston out of a botanical garden flooded the internet. The initial viral video Beatrice and Serena had posted 24 hours earlier, the one framing me as a mentally unstable, jealous wife, resurfaced. But the public narrative had aggressively shifted. People were asking questions. If I was a delusional, unhinged spouse, why were United States Marshals arresting my husband for international wire fraud? My chief public relations officer knew exactly when to strike. She did not issue a defensive corporate statement. She simply released an audio file to every major media outlet in the country. It was the unedited security recording from the Hamptons estate, capturing Beatrice plotting with Preston just days prior. The recording was crystal clear. Millions of people listened to Beatrice's sharp, arrogant voice echoing through their screens. "We locked down his bank accounts today, and never have to deal with his stuck-up relatives again," Beatrice sneered on the tape. She openly mocked Jamal's prestigious family, using vile, racist microaggressions to describe a renowned federal judge and a university dean. Then came the financial plot. "As soon as you secure the Cayman Island transfer, we freeze the rural trash out of her own company," Beatrice instructed her son. The public reaction was instantaneous and completely merciless. The hashtag demanding justice for my company trended globally. Beatrice and Serena were universally branded as predatory, manipulative frauds. At the opening bell, Wall Street analysts predicted a massive plunge in my corporate stock due to the highly publicized domestic drama involving a board member. They were entirely wrong. The financial sector abhors uncertainty and embezzlement, but it absolutely worships decisive, ruthless leadership. When the details of my trap leaked, showing how I had intentionally baited Preston into committing a federal crime to instantly purge a corrupt board member and recover stolen intellectual property, investor confidence skyrocketed. My company stock surged 22% within the first 3 hours of trading. I sat in my corner office watching the green numbers climb across the financial monitors. I had completely amputated the dead weight holding my empire back, and the market was rewarding me for the bloodshed. While my net worth expanded by the minute, Beatrice was desperately trying to claw her way out of federal holding. She secured a predatory bail bond using a fraudulent agreement tied to a trust she no longer controlled. Stepping out of the courthouse in yesterday's wrinkled designer dress, Beatrice realized her social currency was completely bankrupt. Her country club friends were refusing her calls. Her credit cards were frozen solid by federal warrants. She needed public sympathy to survive the impending trial. Beatrice hired a cheap, unethical publicist who booked her an emergency appearance on a prominent daytime television talk show. She intended to manipulate the narrative one last time before her final downfall. I watched the live broadcast from the massive monitor in my boardroom. Beatrice sat on the brightly lit television set, wearing a borrowed beige cardigan to look humble and fragile. She squeezed out practiced tears, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "I am just a terrified widow," Beatrice whimpered to the sympathetic television host. "My son made some poor business decisions, yes. But my daughter-in-law is a ruthless, vindictive billionaire who orchestrated this entire nightmare to punish an innocent family. She threw me out of my ancestral home. She ruined my daughter's wedding. I have absolutely nothing left to my name." The host leaned forward, placing a hand on Beatrice's knee. "It must be incredibly traumatic to face such hostility from someone you welcomed into your home," the host murmured, playing directly into the manufactured drama. Beatrice nodded frantically, her lip quivering with rehearsed perfection. "I just want my family to be safe. I just want to go back to my historic Hamptons estate and try to heal from this psychological abuse." She looked directly into the studio camera, attempting to appeal to the hearts of millions of viewers. "I am begging for a little compassion in this dark time." Suddenly, the television host paused. She pressed a hand against her earpiece, her eyes widening in genuine shock. The sympathetic demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by the sharp, hungry instinct of a breaking news journalist. Beatrice noticed the shift and faltered, her fake tears drying up as panic crept into her chest. The host looked away from Beatrice and turned directly toward the main camera. "We are interrupting this interview with a breaking local news update," the host announced, her voice tight with disbelief. She turned back to Beatrice, who was now visibly trembling on the studio sofa under the bright studio lights. "Ma'am, you just stated that you desperately wanted to return to your historic Hamptons estate to heal." Beatrice nodded slowly, unable to speak, as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over her. The host touched her earpiece again, listening intently to the control room. "We are getting reports right this very second that your primary residence has just been demolished." The aerial footage on the studio monitor showed massive yellow bulldozers tearing through the slate roof of the estate. Beatrice ripped the lapel microphone from her beige cardigan, tearing the delicate fabric in her absolute panic. She ignored the shouts of the television host and sprinted off the set, her designer heels echoing against the studio floor. She flagged down a taxi, screaming at the driver to take her straight to the Hamptons. The 2-hour ride was a suffocating nightmare of frantic phone calls to lawyers who refused to answer and silent prayers to a legacy that no longer existed. When the taxi finally pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the property, Beatrice did not wait for the driver to open her door. She shoved a crumpled $100 bill through the partition and stumbled out onto the gravel driveway. The sheer scale of the destruction hit her like a physical blow. The air was thick with gray dust and the deafening roar of heavy diesel machinery. The entire east wing of the mansion, the sprawling architectural marvel that Beatrice had relentlessly flaunted at every charity gala and country club luncheon, was completely gone. Where towering bay windows and antique mahogany balconies once stood, there was now nothing but a jagged mountain of crushed drywall, splintered wood, and twisted metal rebar. 3 massive bulldozers were actively grinding the remaining foundation into dust. Standing perfectly still amidst the chaotic symphony of demolition was Kira. I wore a tailored ivory pantsuit completely untouched by the swirling debris, paired with a bright yellow hard hat and protective safety glasses. I held a rolled-up set of architectural blueprints in my left hand, casually gesturing to a construction foreman who nodded respectfully before signaling a bulldozer to tear down a surviving stone chimney. Beatrice let out a guttural, agonizing shriek. She scrambled over a pile of shattered bricks, ignoring the thick dust coating her expensive shoes and ruining her carefully styled hair. "What are you doing?" Beatrice roared, coughing violently as the debris filled her lungs. "Stop them right now! You are destroying my family history. This house is a sacred historical landmark of my ancestors. You cannot just tear it down. I turned slowly, removing my safety glasses. I looked at Beatrice, whose face was streaked with sweat, tears, and gray dust. I did not raise my voice over the roar of the engines. I simply stepped closer, invading her space, letting the cold reality of her absolute ruin wash over her. I gestured toward the mountain of rubble that used to be her prized east wing. Your ancestors lost this house to the bank 30 years ago. Beatrice, I stated, my voice slicing through the noise with terrifying clarity. Your family squandered their fortune on failed investments and terrible gambling habits long before I ever met your pathetic son. You have been living in a bank-owned foreclosure property for 3 decades, renting the illusion of wealth on credit you could not afford. I bought this estate from the bank. It is not history. It is just cheap drywall and rotting wood, and frankly, I wanted a better view of the ocean. Beatrice stared at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot. Her entire identity, the carefully manufactured illusion of old money, superiority that she used to terrorize and belittle me, was literally crushed into dust beneath my designer boots. She had spent years treating me like an uneducated peasant simply because I built my wealth from nothing, while she hid behind the stolen glory of a dead bloodline. You are a monster! Beatrice hissed, her voice shaking with pure, unadulterated venom. You took my son. You destroyed my daughter. You stole my home. You are nothing but a vindictive new money parasite trying to erase your own miserable background by destroying your betters. I smiled, a slow, calculated expression that offered absolutely zero mercy. I did not steal anything, Beatrice. I repossessed what was mine. You wanted to play games with federal wire fraud and offshore accounts to fund your country club tabs. You thought I was just a naive software developer you could bleed dry. You forgot that I write the code that runs the system. You are out of money. You are out of credit. Your social circle has completely blacklisted you. You have absolutely nothing left. The raw, undeniable truth finally snapped the last remaining thread of Beatrice's sanity. She let out a wild, feral scream and lunged forward, her hands curled into claws, aiming directly for my face. She intended to tear my eyes out, desperate to inflict any kind of physical pain to match her total psychological destruction. I did not even flinch. I did not step back or raise my hands to defend myself. Before Beatrice could close the distance, Commander Vance materialized from the dust. The tactical security leader stepped effortlessly between us, catching Beatrice by her upper arms. He hoisted her backward with a single powerful motion, planting her firmly on her feet a safe distance away from me. Beatrice thrashed against his iron grip, kicking her ruined heels against his heavy tactical boots, sobbing hysterically as the bulldozers continued to grind her fake legacy into powder. Let her go, Vance, I ordered calmly. Vance immediately released his grip and stepped back, keeping his eyes locked on the hysterical woman. Beatrice stumbled, falling to her knees in the dirt, completely defeated. She looked up at me, her chest heaving, waiting for the final blow. I reached to my side, grabbing an object leaning against a stack of unbroken marble tiles. I stepped forward and dropped it directly onto the gravel in front of Beatrice's knees. It was an industrial mop with a bright yellow bucket. Beatrice stared at the cleaning supplies, fresh tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. What is this? She whispered, her voice broken. Take this mop. My tech hub needs a janitor, otherwise sleep outside. I returned to my corporate headquarters, leaving Beatrice standing in the dust. I sat behind my glass desk when the private secure line on my console began to flash red. The caller identification displayed a restricted government number. I pressed the flashing button. An automated voice announced it was a collect call from a federal holding facility. I accepted. Kira, please tell me you are there. Preston sounded absolutely pathetic, the arrogant, touchable tune he had used to mock my rural upbringing just 24 hours ago was completely gone. His voice was cracked, raw, and thick with frantic theatrical tears. The echo of the concrete federal holding cell reverberated in the background. I am here, Preston. I replied, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. He let out a shaky, desperate sob, launching straight into his practiced manipulation. Kira, you have to help me. It is terrible in here. They treated me like a common criminal. They stripped my clothes. They took my watch. You have to post my bail. Please, I am begging you. I know I messed up. I know I was greedy, but I was just trying to protect our family legacy. My mother pushed me into it. She was bleeding my accounts dry. You have to believe me, Kira. I never wanted to hurt you. I love you. The sheer audacity of his lies was almost entertaining. I was employing the exact same narcissistic tactics he had used for 3 years, assuming I was still the naive software developer, desperate for his high society approval. He thought a few manufactured tears would erase his attempt to steal my life's work. He genuinely believed I would fold under the pressure of his emotional extortion. I need you to wire the bail money, Preston pleaded, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. If you get me out of here today, I swear I will make this easy for you. I will sign the divorce papers right now. I will not contest a single asset. I will walk away quietly and let you keep the company. The house is everything. Just pay the bond, Kira. Please. I cannot survive in this place. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the glass desk. You already signed away your leverage, Preston. You triggered the corporate buyout clause yourself at the rehearsal dinner. You terminated your own board seat. And since the funds you used to buy your shares were obtained through federal wire fraud, those shares are subject to immediate government seizure. You have absolutely nothing left to negotiate with. The line went dead silent. The frantic sobbing stopped instantly. When Preston spoke again, the pathetic begging husband was gone. The venomous entitled parasite returned, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated malice. You really think you are untouchable, Preston snarled, his tone dropping into a vicious, threatening register. You think because you bought a few judges and hired some tactical guards that you won this game. You are just a peasant playing dress-up, Kira. And I am about to burn your entire digital empire to the ground. I remained perfectly still. What are you talking about, Preston? He let out a harsh, victorious laugh. Did you actually believe I spent 3 years just looking at your financial spreadsheets? I had my accountant plant a custom backdoor virus deep inside your primary supply chain software. It is a logic bomb, Kira. It is sitting completely undetected in your source code. If I do not log in and reset the encryption key within the next 12 hours, the malware will automatically deploy. It will wipe your client databases, crash your international logistics, and permanently delete every single patent file you hold. Your company stock will hit zero by tomorrow morning. He paused, letting his threat hang in the cold air of the federal prison line. Now here are my new terms, Preston demanded, arrogance flooding back into his chest. You are going to wire $10 million to an offshore account I provide. You are going to post my bail, and you are going to publicly drop all civil charges against me. If you refuse, your life's work disappears at midnight. I did not panic. I did not scream. I slowly pulled my wireless keyboard toward me and began typing. The rhythmic clacking of the keys echoed over the speakerphone. What are you doing? Preston snapped, his false confidence wavering slightly at my silence. Did you hear me? I will destroy your company. I kept typing, pulling up a highly secure encrypted server file on my dual monitors. You mean the malware on server 4? I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. The incredibly amateur Trojan virus you tried to hide behind a fake firewall update last month. Preston stopped breathing. The silence from the federal holding facility was absolute. I found your little logic bomb weeks ago, I explained, hitting the final execution key on my keyboard. But I did not delete it. That would have been a waste of a perfectly good trap. Instead, I carefully isolated the virus, rewrote the target destination, and quietly rerouted the payload directly into your own personal, highly encrypted hard drive. I leaned into the microphone, delivering the final fatal execution, the one you keep hidden in your private home office. The virus deployed the second you triggered the buyout clause at the country club. But it did not delete anything, Preston. It unencrypted every single file you thought was locked. The FBI Cyber Division just found 10 years of your illegal offshore gambling rings. Thanks for calling on a recorded federal line, Preston. I disconnected the call and listened to the dial tone echoing through my office. Preston had always believed his elite upbringing made him invincible, assuming my rural roots equated to technological ignorance. He failed to realize that while he was busy inheriting his wealth, I was busy writing the code that controlled it. He was officially out of moves. While Preston sat stewing in a federal holding cell, his sister was discovering just how quickly a false empire crumbles. Serena had spent her entire life coasting on the illusion of her family legacy, using her fabricated social status to manipulate everyone around her. Now, carrying a $500,000 debt that I legally owned, she was completely desperate. She rapidly drove her leased luxury vehicle to the exclusive athletic club downtown. She was hunting for the personal trainer she had thrown away her prestigious wedding for. She cornered him in the private VIP lounge. She did not approach him with romance or regret. She approached him with pure extortion. She demanded $50,000 in cash, immediately threatening to expose their affair to the wealthy married clients he routinely trained. Serena thought she was being ruthless, playing the only card she had left to secure financial survival. The trainer did not flinch. He did not beg for her silence. He simply laughed directly in her face. He reached into his gym bag, pulled out his smartphone, and tapped the screen. A crystal-clear audio recording filled the empty lounge. It was Serena's own arrogant voice recorded just a week prior, while they were tangled in his hotel bed. On the recording, Serena laughed cruelly, bragging about how she found Jamal incredibly boring, but was solely marrying him to secure a permanent pipeline to his family fortune. She detailed exactly how she planned to divert Jamal's medical salary into her own private accounts while keeping the trainer on the side. The trainer locked his phone and looked at Serena with absolute disgust. He told her she was a bankrupt, toxic liability. He had already forwarded the recording to Jamal the moment the wedding imploded, ensuring his own name was kept out of the crossfire. He signaled the club security, having Serena physically escorted out the back service doors like common trash. Serena stumbled out into the damp alleyway behind the athletic club, the heavy metal doors slamming shut behind her. She pulled out her phone, frantically scrolling through her contacts, desperately calling the elite women she used to host lavish brunches with. Every single call went straight to voicemail. Her messages were left unread. High society operates on a strict currency of wealth and reputation, and Serena was completely bankrupt in both. She walked to a corner cafe, hoping to buy a cheap coffee to steady her shaking hands. But the barista handed her card back with a sympathetic wince. Declined. The reality of her situation hit her with the force of a concrete wall. She had no money, no home, no allies, and a massive debt hanging over her head. The syndicate contract I had purchased stipulated aggressive daily interest. If she failed to establish a payment plan, I held the absolute legal right to garnish any future wages she might ever earn or pursue further legal action that would land her in a cell right next to her brother. With her leased car, running on fumes, and her stomach completely empty, Serena was forced to do the one thing she swore she would never do. She drove to my corporate headquarters. The massive, imposing glass and steel skyscraper towered over the city district, a physical monument to the empire she and her mother had tried to steal. Serena walked through the revolving glass doors looking entirely out of place. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her hair unwashed, and the arrogant strut she usually carried was completely gone. She approached the front security desk fully expecting to be thrown out onto the pavement. The head of security checked her identification, then looked at his monitor. He did not call the police. He simply handed her a temporary visitor badge and pointed toward the executive elevators. I had left standing orders to let her up. I knew she would eventually come crawling. Serena rode the elevator to the top floor, her hands trembling as the doors parted. She walked slowly into my expansive corner office. I was seated behind my desk, reviewing a logistics report, not bothering to look up as she approached. Serena stood before me completely broken. She did not yell or demand respect. She fell to her knees right on my office carpet, her voice cracking as she begged for financial mercy. She pleaded for a job, swearing she would work in my corporate marketing department to pay off the massive debt. She arrogantly assumed her worthless communications degree still entitled her to an executive salary and a comfortable desk. I finally looked up, placing my pen down. I did not offer her a tissue or a glass of water. I pulled a thin, single-page contract from my top drawer and slid it across the glass surface. I am not hiring you for marketing, Serena, I stated coldly. You are going to work off your $500,000 debt exactly the way you should have built your life, with grueling, exhausting labor. This is a contract for a data entry position in our subterranean server facility. You will manually log inventory codes. You will receive minimum wage and 100% of your paycheck will be automatically garnished to service your debt to me. Serena stared at the paper in sheer horror. She opened her trembling mouth to loudly protest, to beg for a better position, but the absolute zero mercy in my eyes silenced her completely. She reached with a shaking hand and signed her name on the dotted line, officially signing away her freedom. I pulled a large plastic bag from under my desk and tossed it directly onto her lap. "You start at midnight," I commanded, my voice slicing through her remaining pride. "And Serena, you have to wear the uniform." She slowly pulled the heavy synthetic fabric out of the crinkling plastic bag, her eyes widening in utter disbelief. It was an embarrassing bright neon orange jumpsuit emblazoned with a massive janitorial barcode. I left Serena trembling in my executive office, clutching the neon orange fabric. I did not waste another second watching her comprehend her absolute ruin. I walked out of my suite, heading straight for the primary boardroom. I had called a mandatory emergency meeting for all senior corporate executives. The heavy glass doors slid open. The atmosphere inside the sunlit boardroom was thick with tension. 15 powerful corporate directors sat around the mahogany table. At the far end sat Bradley, my chief financial officer. He was adjusting his silk tie, attempting to mask his rising panic. He knew Preston was in federal custody, and he knew I was cleaning house. Before I could sit, Bradley stood up. He flattened his hands against the polished wood, puffing his chest to project false authority and strike first. "Kira, we must address the events of the past 48 hours, Bradley announced. "This room is disturbed by the public spectacle you created. Federal raids, viral videos, the arrest of your husband. This erratic behavior damages our long-term corporate stability." Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Bradley seized on their hesitation, pushing harder. He wanted to paint me as the hysterical wife tearing the company apart for personal vengeance. "Preston brought elite diplomacy here," Bradley continued. "Your actions represent a massive liability. I am calling for a vote of no confidence. We need to remove you immediately, place you on administrative leave, and appoint an interim director before your vindictive drama bankrupts us all." Bradley looked around the table, waiting for nods of agreement. He genuinely believed his slick corporate jargon would override the fact that he was actively covering his own tracks. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to defend my emotional stability. I simply unclasped my leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of 15 thick, perfectly bound dossiers. I handed the stack to my executive assistant, who immediately began walking around the table, placing a heavy file directly in front of every single board member. Bradley frowned, his arrogant posture faltering slightly. "What is this?" he demanded. "I suggest you open it, Bradley." I stated, my voice terrifyingly calm and devoid of any hesitation. "Since you are so deeply concerned about shareholder value and corporate liabilities, I thought the board should review our most recent internal audit." The sound of thick paper flipping filled the silent room. The board members opened their dossiers. The color drained from their faces almost simultaneously. The room temperature seemed to plummet as the reality of the documents set in. Inside each dossier were meticulously categorized, highly encrypted email logs, offshore routing numbers, and direct wire transfer receipts. I had spent the last month using my own tracking software to map every single digital footprint in the building. Those documents detail exactly how Preston managed to bypass our internal security protocols to siphon $10 million into his Cayman Island accounts, I explained, looking directly into Bradley's terrified eyes. Preston is not a software engineer. He needed someone with high-level administrative access to authorize the transfers and falsify the quarterly expenditure reports. He needed our chief financial officer. Bradley stumbled backward, his legs hitting his leather chair. A strangled gasp escaped his throat as the older board members glared at him with absolute disgust. "If you turn to page 4, I continued relentlessly, "you will see the exact dates and times Bradley authorized those fraudulent transfers. On page 5, you will see the corresponding kickbacks. Preston paid Bradley a bribe of $250,000 per transaction, funneled through a fake consulting firm registered under his wife's maiden name. The board erupted into furious shouts. The older executives demanded immediate answers, waving the damning evidence in the air. Bradley was completely exposed. The polished elite corporate shield he wore had evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, cornered thief. He knew the federal agents who arrested Preston would be tearing through these exact same financial records by noon. He knew he was looking at decades in a federal penitentiary for corporate espionage and wire fraud. Bradley did not try to explain. He did not ask for a lawyer. Pure, unadulterated adrenaline took over his brain. He turned on his heel and bolted. He shoved past a senior director, knocking a tray of water glasses onto the carpet, and sprinted frantically toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. He burst into the executive corridor, his expensive leather shoes sliding wildly on the marble floor. He was desperate to reach the private executive elevators, hoping to flee the state before I could lock down the building. He slammed his fist against the elevator call button, looking back over his shoulder with wide, panicked eyes. The digital floor indicator chimed. The polished steel doors slid open seamlessly. Bradley lunged forward to step inside, but he slammed into a solid, unmoving chest. Standing inside the elevator was Jamal. The brilliant neurosurgeon looked completely in his element, wearing a razor-sharp charcoal suit. His posture radiated the quiet, lethal authority of a man who belonged to one of the most powerful families in Washington. He did not step aside. He stood perfectly centered in the elevator cabin, holding a sleek black leather briefcase in his right hand. "Going somewhere?" Jamal asked. His deep voice resonated through the corridor, calm and commanding. "You forgot your severance package." Jamal stepped out of the elevator, forcing Bradley to stumble backward into the corridor. Jamal casually flipped the latches on his briefcase. The lid popped open. Inside were not medical files or business contracts. The briefcase was packed with freshly printed, federally mandated subpoenas authorized by his mother, the federal judge. Jamal pulled a thick stack of legal documents from the case and slapped them against Bradley's chest. "Consider yourself officially served," Jamal stated, his eyes locking onto the financial officer. I watched from the doors as my business partner executed the trap flawlessly. The alliance was permanently sealed. Beatrice stepped out of the courthouse in yesterday's wrinkled designer dress, the fabric stiff and smelling faintly of the botanical garden soil. The reality of her situation had not entirely pierced her arrogance yet. She clutched her luxury handbag, convinced this was merely a temporary setback. Her son's arrest was a tragic misunderstanding, the frozen bank accounts a bureaucratic error that a few well-placed phone calls to her powerful friends would instantly resolve. She walked to the corner, intending to hail a cab to her favorite boutique hotel in Manhattan, fully expecting them to bill her standard account. She pulled out her phone to call Evelyn, her closest confidant at the elite country club. The line rang twice before a curt automated message informed her the number was no longer in service. Beatrice frowned, dialing another friend, then another. Every single call was either ignored or immediately sent to voicemail. The social blackout was absolute and instantaneous. In her world, financial insolvency was a fatal disease, and federal indictments were highly contagious. Her so-called friends had already seen the viral videos and the morning news broadcasts. They were aggressively severing all ties to protect their own pristine reputations. Denial fueling her steps. Beatrice flagged down a yellow taxi. She barked an address for a mid-tier hotel, reasoning she could tolerate slightly less luxurious accommodations until the mess was sorted. The driver glanced at her disheveled appearance, but started the meter. 20 minutes later, she stood at the reception desk, slapping her platinum credit card onto the counter with practiced entitlement. "I need a suite, preferably away from the elevators," she demanded. The young receptionist swiped the card. The machine beeped sharply. Declined. He tried again. Same sharp beep. Beatrice's face flushed hot with indignation. "Try it again. Your machine is obviously malfunctioning. Do you have any idea who I am?" The receptionist looked at his monitor, his expression shifting from polite customer service to guarded caution. "Ma'am, the system says the card is confiscated. Not just declined. I have to retain the physical card. The bank has flagged it due to federal asset freezes directed by the Internal Revenue Service." Beatrice snatched her hand back as if the card terminal had burned her. "The IRS." The words tasted like ash. The federal agents had not just locked down Preston's offshore accounts. They had completely frozen every single asset connected to the family's fraudulent tax filings. She had exactly $37 in cash in her designer purse. Panicking, she rushed out of the hotel lobby. She walked for hours as the sun began to set, the crisp evening air biting through her thin dress. The manicured streets of the affluent neighborhoods faded into the grittier industrial sections of the city. Her expensive heels blistered her feet. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. The absolute crushing weight of poverty finally broke through her denial. She was homeless. With no other options, Beatrice found herself standing outside a brick building with a faded sign above the reinforced steel door, the Hope Haven Women's Shelter. The sheer indignity of it made her physically nauseous, but the dropping temperature forced her hand. She pushed the heavy door open and stepped into a stark, brightly lit intake room. The smell of bleach and institutional food replaced the scent of imported orchids she was accustomed to. A line of exhausted-looking women stood waiting at the front desk. Beatrice shoved past them, ignoring their irritated mutters, and marched straight up to the intake window. "I need a private room immediately," she demanded, her voice shrill with desperate arrogance. "And I require clean sheets, not whatever this place usually provides." The woman sitting behind the scratched plexiglass window slowly looked up from her clipboard. She wore a simple faded blue uniform polo, her hair pulled back into a practical bun. Beatrice felt a sudden terrifying jolt of recognition. She knew that face. 3 years ago, Beatrice had hosted a lavish charity gala at the country club. She had demanded perfection from the catering staff. During the appetizer service, this very woman had been carrying a heavy tray of champagne flutes. Another guest had bumped her, causing a few drops of ice water to splash onto the toe of Beatrice's custom Italian leather shoes. Beatrice had flown into a vicious rage, screaming at the woman in front of hundreds of elite guests. She had demanded the catering manager fire the woman, immediately refusing to pay the entire invoice until she saw the woman escorted out the service doors in tears. That woman had lost a desperately needed job simply because Beatrice wanted to assert her dominance. Now the woman sat calmly behind the intake glass, holding the clipboard that controlled Beatrice's access to a warm bed and a hot meal. The intake administrator did not scowl. She did not yell or demand an apology for the humiliation she had suffered 3 years prior. She simply looked at Beatrice, taking in the ruined designer dress, the smudged makeup, and the absolute raw terror radiating from her eyes. "You do not get a private room here," the administrator stated, her voice perfectly level, carrying the quiet authority of someone who actually worked for a living. "We process intakes based on availability, not demands. Name." Beatrice opened her mouth, her pride warring furiously with her survival instinct. "Beatrice," she whispered, her voice cracking. The administrator typed the name into the old, clunky computer. The keystrokes sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. She printed out a small laminated badge attached to a cheap plastic lanyard and slid it through the slot in the plexiglass. "Welcome, Beatrice," the administrator said, offering a warm, terrifyingly sincere smile. "Your bed is in the communal ward. It is cot number 42. You sleep next to the bathroom doors. Lights out is strictly at 8 p.m. We do not offer room service, and everyone here earns their keep by doing daily chores." The administrator reached under her desk and pulled out an object, sliding it forcefully through the large supply slot at the bottom of the window. The object clattered onto the scuffed linoleum floor right at Beatrice's ruined designer shoes. It was a plastic toilet brush. "Here is your toilet brush," the administrator added, her smile never wavering. "Report to the second-floor latrines at dawn. Do not be late." 6 months after Beatrice scrubbed her first latrine, the federal trial officially commenced in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. Preston walked into the courtroom wearing a tailored suit that he had likely used the last of his hidden cash to procure. Despite facing 15 years in a federal penitentiary, Preston still carried himself with the insufferable swagger of a Hamptons aristocrat. He genuinely believed that the laws of the United States simply did not apply to men with his pedigree. This delusion reached its absolute peak the moment the presiding judge called the court to order. Preston stood up, adjusted his silk tie, and arrogantly announced that he was formally terminating his court-appointed public defender. He claimed the overworked attorney lacked the intellectual capacity to understand complex elite finance. Against the stern, repeated warnings of the federal judge Preston elected to represent himself, he surveyed the jury box with a slick, practiced smile, utterly convinced that his hereditary charm could effortlessly dismantle a federal wire fraud indictment. He thought he was walking into a negotiation. He did not realize he was stepping onto an execution block. The prosecution spent the first 3 days systematically tearing his life apart. They presented the offshore routing numbers, the forged signatures, and the direct digital footprint linking Preston to the Cayman Island accounts. Any rational defendant would have pleaded for a plea deal. Preston simply scoffed, pacing the courtroom floor like he was hosting a corporate seminar. He objected to hard empirical evidence by citing his family's historic contributions to the local economy. He treated the federal prosecutors like unruly employees, dismissing their financial logs as mere accounting errors. His strategy was entirely built on character assassination. He intended to paint himself as the wealthy, trusting husband who had been ruthlessly manipulated by a greedy, uneducated woman. He needed the jury to believe that I was the mastermind who framed him to steal his ancestral wealth. When the prosecution detailed how the $10 million was illegally funneled through a shell company, Preston loudly interrupted, claiming I had authorized the transfer to hide my own corporate debts. He was building a massive mountain of perjury, totally blind to the fact that his arrogance was alienating every single person sitting in the jury box. On the fourth day, the prosecution called their primary witness. I walked through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit. I did not look at the defense table where my husband sat. I walked straight to the witness stand, swore the oath, and took my seat. After the prosecution finished their direct examination, firmly establishing my sole ownership of the stolen funds and the illegal nature of the transfer, the judge turned to the defense. Preston stood up, buttoning his jacket. He swaggered toward the witness stand, his eyes gleaming with malicious anticipation. He thought he finally had me trapped in a public forum where I was forced to answer his questions. He leaned against the wooden podium, looking me up and down with deep theatrical disgust. He began his cross-examination not by questioning the wire transfers, but by aggressively attacking my origins. He wanted to humiliate me on the federal record, attempting to reduce the chief executive officer of a global tech empire back into the poor rural girl he always believed I was. His ego simply demanded a cruel, vicious public spectacle inside the courtroom. "Let us talk about your background," Kira Preston began, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "Before you married into my family, you were living in a rural, rundown town, correct? You did not attend an Ivy League university. You had absolutely zero access to high society networking. You were a nobody to the rest of the world." The prosecution immediately objected to relevance, but I raised my hand slightly, signaling to the federal prosecutor that I wanted to answer. The judge allowed the questioning to proceed. "I grew up in poverty, Preston," I answered calmly, my voice projecting clearly across the silent courtroom. "I built my initial software architecture on a refurbished laptop in a public library. I did not have a trust fund to fall back on." Preston smiled triumphantly, turning to face the jury box to ensure they caught his fabricated narrative. He paced back and forth, dramatically waving his hands. "Exactly," Preston gloated. "You had absolutely nothing. You were a complete failure until you met me. My family provided the capital, the elite social introductions, and the prestigious reputation required to secure your venture funding. Without our legacy, you were bankrupt. You would still be rotting away in obscurity without my charity." Preston whipped back around, stepping dangerously close to the witness stand. He pointed an accusatory finger directly at my face, attempting to deliver what he thought was his masterpiece performance. "Is it not true you could not have built this company without my family's connections?" Preston demanded, his voice echoing loudly off the courtroom walls. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. Instead, I maintained perfect eye contact with him, while the courtroom held its collective breath in anticipation of my response. I calmly reached into my leather briefcase resting beside my chair. I pulled out a small sealed glass frame and held it up for the entire courtroom to see. Inside the glass was a faded coffee-stained paper napkin covered in complex mathematical algorithms and system architecture notes. "This is the original patent design," I stated, my voice slicing through his arrogance like a surgical blade. "It is officially dated and notarized 2 years before I even met you." I looked directly into Preston's terrified eyes, watching his elite facade completely shatter in front of the federal judge. "You didn't give me connections, Preston. You gave me a lesson in how to spot a parasite." The entire jury gasped in unison. The sharp gasp from the jury box echoed through the cavernous federal courtroom, hanging in the air like a death sentence. Preston stood frozen at the podium, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. His expensive tailored suit suddenly looked like it belonged on a cheap impostor. He stared at the framed coffee-stained napkin in my hand, the undeniable physical proof that completely obliterated his entire defense strategy. He had built his case on the lie that I was a helpless, uneducated woman who relied solely on his generational wealth to succeed. That single piece of paper proved I was the sole architect of the software empire he tried to steal. The lead federal prosecutor seized the moment immediately. "No further questions for this witness, Your Honor," the prosecutor announced, his voice ringing with absolute confidence. The judge slammed his gavel, ordering Preston to step away from the podium and return to the defense table. Preston stumbled backward, his arrogant posture completely shattered. He sank into his wooden chair, looking like a man who had just watched his own execution broadcast live. I stepped down from the witness stand, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, and returned to my seat in the front row of the gallery. I did not look back at him. I had already delivered the fatal blow. The trial moved swiftly into closing arguments. The federal prosecution was ruthless, methodical, and brutally efficient. They displayed the financial logs, the offshore routing numbers, and the forged signature contracts on the massive monitors for the jury. The prosecutor walked slowly in front of the jury box, locking eyes with each citizen. He did not just paint Preston as a white-collar criminal. He painted him as a cowardly, parasitic thief who exploited his own marriage for financial gain. When it was Preston's turn to deliver his closing argument, the courtroom braced for his defense. Instead, they witnessed a spectacular, humiliating meltdown. Preston walked to the center of the room, sweating profusely, his hands trembling as he clutched a stack of unorganized handwritten notes. He abandoned any pretense of legal strategy. He completely forgot the rules of courtroom decorum. Instead, he launched into a frantic, desperate rant, blaming everyone but himself. He pointed fingers at his offshore accountant. He blamed the corporate loopholes. But his most vicious attack was directed at the back of the courtroom. Preston turned around and pointed a shaking finger directly at his own mother. He screamed that Beatrice was the true mastermind, claiming she constantly pressured him to secure funds to maintain their elite social standing. He told the jury that his mother forced him into the embezzlement scheme because she had squandered their ancestral wealth decades ago. He aired every dirty family secret onto the federal record, completely destroying whatever was left of their prestigious name. I shifted my gaze to the gallery seating. Beatrice sat hunched in the very last row, completely unrecognizable from the arrogant matriarch who used to terrorize me at country club dinners. She was wearing a cheap faded beige sweater and scuffed synthetic shoes. The designer jewelry and imported silk dresses were gone, liquidated to pay off her mounting legal debts. She sat in absolute silence, her face gaunt and pale, watching the golden boy she had worshipped her entire life throw her directly under a federal bus just to save his own skin. The utter destruction of their family loyalty was playing out for everyone to see, and Beatrice had no choice but to sit there and swallow the humiliation. She shrank down in her seat, burying her face in her trembling hands. The jury did not even need a full day to deliberate. Less than 4 hours later, the court bailiff announced that a verdict had been reached. The tension in the room was suffocating as the 12 jurors filed back into their designated seats. Preston stood at the defense table, gripping the wood so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breathing was shallow and erratic. He looked desperately at the jury foreman, searching for any sign of mercy. He found absolutely none. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The judge asked, his voice carrying the full heavy weight of the justice system. "We have your honor," the foreman replied, standing up and unfolding a crisp piece of paper. "On the first count of international wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty." Preston let out a strangled, breathless gasp. "On the second count of corporate embezzlement, we find the defendant guilty. On the third count of aggravated forgery, we find the defendant guilty." The words dropped like heavy iron anvils, sealing Preston's fate permanently. He collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands as loud, uncontrollable sobs racked his body. The judge did not schedule a separate sentencing hearing. He had watched Preston perjure himself, insult the court, and attempt to manipulate the federal justice system with unearned arrogance. The judge looked directly at my husband, his expression radiating pure judicial disgust. "You have demonstrated absolutely zero remorse throughout this trial," the judge stated coldly. "You exploited your marriage, attempted to steal intellectual property, and violated federal financial laws, with blatant disregard for the consequences. You believed your social status granted you immunity. This court is here to remind you that no one is above the law. On all counts, I sentence you to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Given the severity of your financial crimes and your complete lack of cooperation, this sentence is to be served consecutively with absolutely no possibility of early parole." Preston screamed. It was a raw, visceral sound of pure terror. He thrashed against the defense table, begging the judge to reconsider, pleading for mercy, but his desperate cries fell on deaf ears. Two heavy-set federal bailiffs immediately stepped forward, grabbing Preston by his arms and hauling him forcefully to his feet. The sharp, metallic snap of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly, cutting right through his pathetic weeping. As the bailiffs dragged him toward the side door that led directly to the holding cells, Preston stopped struggling for a fraction of a second. He turned his head and looked wildly across the courtroom, his red, tear-stained eyes locking directly onto mine. He was looking for any trace of the woman who used to love him. He was searching my face for a shred of pity, a hint of regret, or a sign that I might use my massive wealth to appeal his case. I desperately needed validation that he still mattered to me. I sat perfectly straight in the front row. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I offered him absolutely nothing. I slowly lifted my left wrist, pulling back the sleeve of my tailored navy suit. I calmly checked the time on my diamond-encrusted designer watch. Then I stood up, turned my back on his sobbing, pathetic figure, and I walked straight out the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. The heavy thud of the oak ceiling behind me was the definitive end of a decaying dynasty. I did not pause for the swarm of reporters waiting on the courthouse steps. My security detail parted the sea of flashing cameras and shouted questions, escorting me into the back of my waiting vehicle. The legal war was officially over. I had won everything. By the following Monday, I initiated a total corporate purge and rebranding campaign. The industry needed to understand that my software empire was no longer tethered to any marital liabilities or old money parasites. I stripped away the original holding company name, launching a sleek, hyper-aggressive rebrand that cemented my status as a solitary titan in the tech industry. Market analysts scrambled to keep up as my valuations soared past previous projections. Without the constant financial bleed of my former husband and his greedy relatives, my capital expanded exponentially. I was no longer playing defense. I was rewriting the entire global market. I did not hoard the reclaimed wealth. I channeled it into a strategic, devastatingly powerful alliance. Jamal walked into my newly redesigned corner office 2 weeks later, flanked by his parents. The federal judge and the university dean did not view me as a rural outsider. They looked at me as an equal, a woman who had ruthlessly excised a cancer that had nearly infected their own family. We sat around my glass conference table, signing the foundational documents for a massive philanthropic tech initiative. The program was designed specifically to fund and fast-track underprivileged youth in Washington, D.C. into elite coding and robotics academies. Jamal leaned over the documents, his signature finalizing our joint venture. He looked up, his sharp eyes radiating genuine respect. "We are building a pipeline that bypasses the generational gatekeepers," Jamal stated, handing me the pen. "We are giving these kids the exact tools you use to conquer the system." I signed my name next to his, cementing a partnership built on mutual integrity and absolute precision. 6 months after the federal sentencing, I took a private helicopter back to the Hamptons estate. The coastal air whipped through my hair as I stepped onto the newly poured concrete helipad. The property was completely unrecognizable from the pretentious, decaying monument to vanity that Beatrice used to parade around in. The demolished East Wing had not been rebuilt with fake historical brick. Instead, a spectacular ultra-modern glass and steel pavilion stood in its place, reflecting the crashing waves of the Atlantic Ocean. I had transformed the $100 million compound into an exclusive, highly secured retreat specifically designed for female founders. The sprawling grounds now housed state-of-the-art server rooms, collaborative workspaces, and venture capital pitching arenas. It was a fortress for brilliant women who were building their own empires from scratch, far away from the manipulative grip of entitled men. We were creating a new breed of untouchable innovators. The inaugural opening gala for the retreat was the most coveted invitation of the year. The very same elite socialites who had previously shunned me under Beatrice's influence were now desperately begging my public relations team for a pass to get through the front gates. I denied every single one of them. The guest list was strictly reserved for self-made innovators, angel investors, and the intellectual powerhouses from Jamal's Washington circles. We did not need fake aristocrats pretending to understand hard work. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the ocean in brilliant shades of violet and gold, the glass pavilion filled with the sharp, dynamic energy of actual visionaries. I stood near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing a tailored ivory suit that contrasted sharply against the dark evening sky. Jamal stood beside me, clinking his crystal glass against mine, in a silent toast to our absolute victory. The string quartet played a modern, upbeat symphony, completely replacing the stuffy, outdated atmosphere the previous owners had desperately clung to. The air smelled of fresh sea salt and unfiltered ambition. I finally felt like I was standing inside my own home. I excused myself from a conversation with a prominent venture capitalist to grab a fresh drink. I walked smoothly across the polished marble floor, navigating through the crowd of brilliant minds. I approached the long black marble catering bar, set up near the edge of the pavilion. A line of catering staff stood at rigid attention, wearing crisp, identical uniforms, holding silver trays loaded with expensive vintage champagne. I did not look at their faces at first. I simply reached out to take a delicate crystal flute. As my fingers wrapped around the chilled stem of the glass, I noticed the hands holding the silver tray were trembling violently. The manicured acrylic nails were gone, replaced by chipped raw edges. I slowly raised my eyes, tracing the stiff, uncomfortable apron up to the server's face. Serena stood completely frozen behind the catering bar. Her designer gowns and fake aristocratic arrogance had been permanently stripped away. She was forced to work grueling, humiliating shifts under the crushing weight of the $500,000 mob debt I now legally owned. Her face was pale, devoid of the expensive makeup she used to hide her malicious nature. She could not even summon the courage to look me in the eye. Serena immediately dropped her gaze, staring intensely at her cheap, sensible work shoes in absolute suffocating shame. She was nothing but a servant in the exact house she used to claim as her royal birthright. Her breathing was ragged, terrified I might cause a scene and cost her the minimum wage job keeping her out of prison. I did not pause. I did not offer her a single word of recognition or pity. I simply took the champagne glass off her trembling silver tray without breaking my stride and walked back into my new empire. The opening gala for the Female Founders Retreat was drawing to a close, but the energy inside the glass pavilion remained electric. I walked away from the catering bar, leaving Serena frozen in her neon orange uniform, clutching her silver tray. I did not look back to see if she was crying. Her tears were no longer my currency. I stepped out onto the expansive multi-level mahogany deck that wrapped around the cliffside of the property. The cool, salty breeze from the Atlantic Ocean swept over the terrace, carrying away the heat of the crowded ballroom. The sound of the crashing waves below was a rhythmic, soothing bass line that completely drowned out the memory of Beatrice's screeching voice. I walked over to the thick glass railing, resting my hands against the cool surface, looking out at the endless expanse of dark water. Jamal stepped out onto the deck a moment later, holding 2 fresh glasses of vintage champagne. He walked up beside me, handing me a crystal flute. We stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the moonlight reflect off the rolling tide. The partnership we had forged in the fires of his ruined wedding had solidified into an impenetrable business alliance. Our joint philanthropic tech initiative in Washington, D.C. had secured its first round of massive federal funding just 3 days ago. We had taken the immense wealth his former fiancé tried to steal and weaponized it to educate thousands of underprivileged students. "You threw a hell of a party," Jamal finally said, his deep voice carrying a note of profound respect. "My parents just left. My mother wanted me to tell you that this pavilion is a significant architectural upgrade from the monstrosity that used to sit here. She said the air finally smells clean." I smiled, taking a slow sip of the crisp champagne. "Your mother has excellent taste," I replied. "And she is right. It takes a lot of heavy machinery to dig up decades of deeply rooted rot. But once you clear the foundation, you can build something that actually lasts." Jamal turned slightly, leaning his back against the glass railing to look at the massive illuminated glass structure behind us. Hundreds of brilliant self-made women were networking inside, securing venture capital and building their own empires. He looked back at me, his sharp eyes catching the light from the pavilion. "You did not just beat them, Kira. You completely erased them from the board. Preston is looking at 15 years. Serena is trapped in a basement server room. They are entirely neutralized." I looked down at the champagne bubbles rising in my glass. "I never wanted to fight them, Jamal. I just wanted to build my software company and live my life. But they mistook my silence for weakness. They thought my rural background meant I was uneducated. They assumed that because they inherited their money, they inherently possessed more power than the woman who actually earned it." I turned my gaze away from the ocean and looked straight down over the edge of the balcony. The vantage point offered a clear, unobstructed view of the service driveway located at the back of the property near the industrial kitchens. The high-intensity security floodlights illuminated the asphalt perfectly. The heavy metal service doors swung open. A figure stepped out into the cold night air, struggling under the weight of 2 massive heavy-duty black trash bags. The woman wore a faded, oversized gray uniform provided by the catering company, a stark contrast to the tailored designer dresses she used to parade around in. She dragged the leaking trash bags across the rough asphalt, her cheap synthetic shoes slipping slightly on the slick pavement. It was Beatrice. She had been hired by the third-party cleaning service I contracted for the estate, forced to take the grueling night shift just to afford a bed at a low-income boarding house. She heaved the heavy bags into the massive industrial dumpster, wiping sweat and grime from her forehead with the back of her trembling hand. She looked exhausted, completely defeated, and stripped of every single ounce of her fabricated elite dignity. As she turned to walk back inside the service entrance, something caught her attention. She stopped in the middle of the driveway and slowly tilted her head upward, looking straight up at the massive glass balcony. Our eyes locked across the distance. Beatrice stood frozen in the harsh glare of the security lights, clutching the dirty hem of her gray uniform. She was looking up at the exact spot where her prized historic East Wing used to stand. Instead of her ancestral mahogany balconies, she saw me. The rural, uneducated woman she had tried to destroy, standing at the pinnacle of a $100 million fortress, flanked by the brilliant surgeon her daughter had tried to extort. I did not sneer. I did not shout down at her. I simply stood perfectly straight, radiating absolute untouchable authority. I raised my crystal champagne flute in the air, offering her a slow, deliberate, entirely silent toast. Beatrice's shoulders slumped. The last remaining fragment of her aristocratic pride shattered into a million pieces right there on the service driveway. She dropped her gaze to the asphalt, unable to maintain eye contact with the woman who now owned her entire existence. She turned around, her head hung low in complete absolute shame, and trudged back through the metal service doors, disappearing into the kitchen to finish scrubbing the floors. I lowered my glass and turned my back on the driveway, facing the vibrant, thriving empire I had constructed. I did not feel the need to monologue about healing or closure. I did not need to justify my ruthlessness. The realization was sharp, pristine, and infinitely satisfying. I didn't just survive their attempt to bury me. I bought the graveyard, paved it over with solid concrete, and built a global empire right on top of it. The ultimate, humiliating tragedy of Preston's family was not that they lost their money. It was that they actually believed, even for a single second, that they could ever outsmart me.